Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. Today's guest, Courtney Marchesani, is really one of my very favorites. I think she's been on the show 4 times over the past 6 years. Courtney is the author of a very popular book titled The 4 Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. Her insights into sensitivity help readers identify their gifts of intuition, empathy, vision, and expression as a means to maximize their potential. And as you will soon discover, Courtney's empathetic style emphasizes nonjudgement and acceptance, and learning how sensitivity's silent effects can impact mental, emotional, spiritual health, and wellness. And so with that, let's bring on our guest, Courtney Marchesani. So good to have you back again on the next chapter with Charlie.
Hey, Charlie. Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here again. This is one of my favorite conversations to have, the ones that you and I have, because it's so synergistic.
You know, it's funny.
Have a synergy.
It's so true. And you know what I wrote in preparation? I said, yesterday, you and I have what I call a delightfully frustrating conversation. And it's delightful because it's just delightful chatting with you in such an engaging way, but it's frustrating that we didn't record it because it was a good show, just the two of us talking.
It was really good. There were some really great takeaways for me. I wrote some things down even based off of where we went. So I'm sure it'll be good through today's conversation.
I have no doubt. With you as guest, we will have brilliant insights. So I have so many things I want to discuss today. So why don't we begin with your unique area of expertise, and that is the highly sensitive personality. Now, when most of us think of the sensitive person, we think of someone that is over-emotional. But you have an entirely different definition. What in the language of Courtney Marchesani is a sensitive person?
I wouldn't discount the emotions. I think the emotions, if you have like a bullseye that you're looking at, that regard to the personality and sensitivity, that you're looking at the rings all around that bullseye, I would say emotions are a big part of that board. But when people think about sensitivity, they typically think about it as an issue, as a problem for that person, that it's a weakness, honestly, that it's a weakness. Whereas my perspective is that sensitivity is actually a strength. Now, there is a fine line with regard to reactions that sensitives have towards certain stimulation that comes into their perception. And so it can look erratic, or the person can look like they're unstable. In the moment, they're actually responding to something through their sensory awareness. And that's where my approach is very different from other types of thought about sensitivity.
So part of what you work with is what we call, and know nothing about, but what we call the empath. Is that part of what you work with, is the empath, the person that perceives or intuits auras, energies, what's going on with other people?
Yeah, that's all part of it. I liken it to a spectrum. I explain it as a spectrum with empathy. Empathy is a very real emotional state, but it's also called emotional resonance clinically. They've done clinical studies in different kinds of settings, primarily in healthcare settings, with counselors, doctors, where they experience this empathic response with their patients or with the people that they're working with. And so emotional resonance is a very real clinical term where studies have been done. But it also incorporates a spectrum of experiences go beyond what we typify as an emotional resonance, where we feel what the other person feels in their body. And there is even a certain type of synesthesia on that spectrum, that there are mirror touch synesthetes where they can actually feel the touch or the feelings in that other person's body. they're mirroring. And so there's a lot of theories around this type of empathy, deep empathy, that it could be in the mirror neuron system, or it could be based out of, there's a lot of different theories. But yes, empathy is one part of that spectrum of sensitivity that I teach about and that I work with my own patients on.
But now I want to continue on the idea of the empath. I know a couple people that are proud to say that they're an empath. And anytime somebody defines themselves as something, my first thought is, no, if you call yourself that, then you're not that. That you're a
self-imposed title.
Yeah, you're an empath wannabe. Because if you're an empath, I would know that you're an empath because you would be catching things about me that other people just don't catch. Is that true?
Well, I think that some people might be aware, self-aware, they have empathy or they have deep empathy, and that usually typically comes through these types of experiences that would probably be considered like embarrassing for them, where they feel flooded with emotion and they're responding to it, and that's typically how people learn they're an empath. Another way that people learn that they are an empath is that, let's take healthcare workers, for example, or therapists. If they haven't been trained really well to allow that emotional transference that they feel to break away or to let it run off of them after sessions, the therapist will tend to carry it with them. And that's also not advisable as an empath or as an empathy response, because it's not necessarily their emotion, but they're triggered by it. So that's another way empaths might find out they are an empath. But yeah, I understand what you're saying about empaths or people self-entitling the term empath. They might not actually know what that truly means. It's interesting. It's an interesting concept.
You know, it makes me think of something we talked about yesterday, and that is the idea of detachment. And that you were talking about the importance of detachment, and I could see how an empath would be, a true empath, it would be essential for that individual to be able to detach herself or himself from the emotions, maybe work with them at the time, but then as they walk away to detach them, or they're just carrying the weight of someone else's world with them.
Yeah, and that came up yesterday because we were talking about compassion. That's how we got to the detachment piece, where we were talking about feeling true compassion for someone else, which typically is also associated with suffering, with pain and suffering in the human experience. And so we were talking about detachment as one type of acceptable response for dealing with true human compassion, which is the pain and suffering, where empaths who are not able to detach from someone else's pain and suffering can be subsumed by it. That's what the context of that detachment was, what we were talking about, which is really important because any type of spiritual empath or counselors or chaplains, they have to be able to detach somewhat from pain and suffering in order to allow true compassion when they really sit with others who are experiencing pain or suffering. So that was how that came up.
Yeah, I get that. I think that is in my study of the mystics, that is a very important concept to the mystics, is detachment from self, that we cannot comprehend the divine as long as we're locked into ourselves. We're anthropomorphizing something that does not need to be anthropomorphized. I'm thinking of an old definition that I learned, and I can't even remember why Bob Dylan is involved, but it was something about the relationship of a song that Bob Dylan wrote about Joan Baez. They had this really up and down relationship.
Oh, yeah. And kind of a love affair, almost.
No, it was not almost. It was a love.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a love affair. And he wrote in this one song, and people my age will remember the lyrics, and he said, "I wish for just one moment you could stand inside my shoes, because if you could know just how I feel about you." and
Which could work either way, right? It could
right.
be for lover who is just completely, entranced.
He did not mean it the nice way.
Or it could be the ex, where it's like, I really wish you could understand where I'm at with you right now.
Understand why I can't stand you.
Ways.
But, so I came up with the definition of the difference between sympathy and empathy, or it could be compassion and empathy. And sympathy is, what would I do or feel like if I were in your shoes? And the key word is, what would I feel like if I were in your shoes? So if I was going through your experience, what would I feel like? And that is what most of us do in conversation, is we're talking about what I would feel like. And the true empathetic person is not what I would feel like. What would I feel like if I were you in your shoes? Very different thought. Not what I feel like if I were in your shoes, but if I were you in your shoes. So there's a giant transfer there.
Yeah, and you hear about it. You hear about this talked about in psychology and in therapy, in feelings that are transferred. Clinically, it's called transference. And then there's projection, how we project our feelings out, use other people as projections for it because they're not safe feelings. But I think it's a good point you make, because a lot of people, especially when you're talking about sympathy versus empathy, there's a confusion there. They're not the same thing. Empathy is to be able to look at an experience and sympathize and say, I feel for you and what you're going through. Empathy is different. It's, I step in, I feel you. Like, I actually feel what you're feeling. And so it's hard for people to imagine who don't have that capacity, emotional wherewithal to experience depth of emotions and truly empathize with someone else, because they're mostly feeling sympathy. And then there's some people that don't feel much of anything, so they cannot relate at all. They can't relate at all.
Yeah.
They're like, why are you so... I think that's why there's much confusion that goes on when people say they're an empath, because sometimes they look erratic. They look emotional. They look overly drawn into something, and that's not understood if you don't have that capacity yourself.
It's like, say we're talking about a divorce, death of a parent, and a friend comes to you who is describing, divorce or death of a parent, and you have experienced either one or both of those, and the common response is, I know how you feel. I know exactly how you feel. And in English, Courtney, that's bullshit. You don't.
No. Talked about this too. This came up, and I had an elder who said to me, she had done hospice work and other types of I would just say intense grief counseling, and just being with people and witnessing for them while they were going through their death process. And she and I were talking one day, and she said, I have stopped saying, I know how you feel. And I paused, and I really took in what she said, because it was important and it mattered in terms of how we approach suffering, pain, and could be considered by the person who you're saying to almost as maybe like a trite.
Yes,
or,
yes, it does.
Something to fill in the space. Try to, have an empathy response, but it actually doesn't feel like an empathic response. It actually feels almost maybe superficial. Yeah. You're just saying something to get through the moment. And one of my best teachers, she was an energy teacher. She used to come up from Berkeley, California to Seattle every month and do energy work with a bunch of... She would talk about, when we were in the circle doing these grounding exercises, very much what you and I are discussing about, how to ground your energy, how to stay within your own space, in your own body, and just be protective of yourself. And she said, if people start to cry when we do these energetic exercises, don't put your hand on them or try to soothe their pain if they're tearful and crying. Because what that telegraphs to them is, I'm not okay with you crying. So it's a way of trying to say, stop crying. She was saying the better way to allow someone to feel pain and suffering, let it come through, is to let it happen and just stand and be witness to it. Not even really try to say anything, but just to sit with true compassion. So when compassion came up in our conversation yesterday, these were the concepts I was kind of touching on, and I'm glad that you brought them up, because I feel like sometimes we're just saying things that we feel accustomed to saying without raising our awareness that that's not actually helpful. Those types of things. We don't truly feel it. So
what would you advise people who, let's say someone that, because I just spoke with a friend today who had cancer surgery, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a major deal, and she's fine now. She's just fine, so that's great news. But our family has experienced that. My wife just experienced breast cancer surgery, and so instead of me saying, "Oh, I know how you feel," what would you advise me in that? What would be an appropriate response or question or statement? How would you advise us to manage that situation?
I think that even with grief, if someone passes away, or there's been, recent loss, or even illness and surgeries, and it can be very raw. I think a good question is always to ask, how are you feeling? How are you feeling right now? And that allows people, without any kind of judgment or overlay on it, to share authentically how they feel and to be with that. And I think when we can truly empathize is we don't try to judge it. We try to judge something or judge someone else's experience and put a label on it or a limit.
Yes. And if I may interrupt, it's not judging negatively. It could even be a positive judgment. It is it's characterizing it in a way that's untrue. So please go on. I'm sorry for the interruption.
It's that same concept as when you judge it, even positively, or you put an attribute on it, which is yours, you are taking, what your experience is, and it's that same kind of, I know how you're feeling. Then you judge where that person is, and you might not know. And so it's much richer dialogue to ask thought-provoking questions in that moment, like, how are you feeling? And then really just actively listen. And I know that there's different levels of listening.
Right.
So it's really about active listening and deep listening so people can really feel heard rather than saying, like, I know how you feel. It's allowing that interchange to happen in a very open, free way.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to take this with me, and I'm going to write this down on my notes. How are you feeling? This happened 4 years ago. If this is, I'm thinking of my friend with cancer. How are you feeling about that today? Because I could tell it was a big issue in her life. It was a major issue. How do you feel about that today? That brings up a whole new depth of conversation.
Yeah, and it allows someone to be open and honest and share what they want. But when you say, oh, I know just how you feel, or I know what you went through, it kind of stops the conversation. It can be a conversation interrupter to allow the deeper connection to happen and for the empathy really to come through, because it can just shut it down in a way that the other person just says, oh, okay, they do know how I feel, even if it's well-intentioned.
Yeah.
So when my elder told me that a long time ago, I thought, this is a good suggestion, because it allows one another to be receptive to each other's feelings with true empathy, if it's gonna be an empathizing with one another.
One of my favorite statements when somebody is telling me something deep and important, after they've finished, I say, tell me more. And it's just, and you think they've just gone through the whole thing, but they haven't. They haven't gotten to the depth yet. And, and you could say, tell me more 2 or 3 times, and they will go you think you're going to annoy them, but you're not annoying them. They're actually going to go another level or 2 deeper.
I heard it actually recently. I was back home in Pennsylvania, and I was listening to my local radio station, my mom's, where I grew up on the farm. And they were talking about the upcoming elections, and it was very political. And they were talking about community advocacy, and they were talking about spiritual leaders in the Black community and how they were going to vote. And there was this really contentious battle between the speakers on this radio show. But the host was very good because they were disagreeing, and she said, "Can you tell me more about that?" And it really allowed the one speaker to open up and give justification for the argument. But in the end, they came together and really respected each other's opinions. And I thought "tell me more" was actually the linchpin phrase that allowed that discourse to open up.
Oh, that's great.
Happen. So I know it's a powerful phrase to allow neutrality, non-judgment.
That wasn't Barry Weiss, was it, by any chance?
I have to go back and look at my notes.
Yeah, Barry Weiss is a great interviewer, and she does that a lot. She is a listener. You know what it reminds me of, and then I have a question before we take a break. But what it reminds me of is the really broken, messed up story of Job, and Job's 3 friends, when they first came to him and they saw Job, they spent I don't remember exactly. I think it was like 7 days or something they spent with Job, and they didn't say anything. They just cried with him. They just held him and cried with him, and then they started giving him all of their biblical BS that screwed up everything, and that's why Job is such a challenging book. But I love the beginning where Job's friends didn't try to console him. They wept with him.
I think that's true compassion. You can be together and truly share an emotional response without other things getting in the way, and just being with it. I mean, a lot of people were using a phrase called holding space, as a way to identify holding space so people can allow self-compassion. But I think that when you can let those feelings out together and truly feel one another and allow those, that is compassion. It's a different type of compassion. You're kind of free.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Your feelings together, but it's rare, very rare. We usually want to try to judge and step away from it because it's discomfort.
I'm going to take a couple of different directions. I'm going to take a direction on our last question, and then after a break, I'm going a whole new direction. But this is very important to me as a creative, and I took your highly gifted, highly sensitive test instrument that you use, and it was very, very helpful. And so it did confirm that I am indeed a creative. So this question is important to me, that you write about the sensitive as one with gifts like intuition, empathy, vision, and expression. That sounds to me like a highly creative person. What is the relationship between the sensitive and the creative?
Creatives have a devotion. It's an internal motivation and a drive that is within them. It's born within them, or it's shaped when they're very young. And so they feel compelled to create. Not only is it a compulsion or a compelling feeling, it's also usually a lifelong devotion to it, whatever their creative force and that connection to that source is for them. So it could be music, it could be writing, it could be dance. There's a lot of different ways in which that creativity expresses itself in the person's life, but it's typically a devotion to it. That's how you can tell if it's an expressive personality.
Yeah. My wife, it was recent, within the last 3 weeks, said to me when, I was saying something about that I was discontent, and she goes, "Honey, you don't have the genes. You are not hardwired to be content." And, she didn't mean it as a negative. That explains creativity. I'm not hardwired to be content. I see something more. I see something better. I see improvement, change, value, joy, that is not existing. So I'm not content with the current. I want to see more. That's a lot of creativity for me.
Right, and you have your partner seeing it, where you have that devotion to it. I think the other hallmark is that when creatives and expressives in particular are not connecting that creative source routinely, they try to shut it off or block it or neglect, somehow will create an imbalance where they feel pressed because they're not connecting to it, anxious and depressed. But there's other issues related to it when they're not creating it. So even if it's just journaling or doing poetry routinely to stay connected to that source, they need to be connected to it or they feel funky. It's another part of that.
Oh, you get it. That's because you're a creative. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back, and we're shifting. Not only are we shifting gears, we're getting into a new vehicle, and we're getting into a 4-wheel drive and shifting into off-road.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go, Paul.
I'm ready to go off-road.
Hi there, this is Charlie Hedges, and you are listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie. And today, I'm so fortunate to have friends like Courtney Marchesani, who has been on the show at least 4 times. We're having a debate on how many times she's been on the show, but I feel like she could be on every week. She's so brilliant. So we have been talking about the sensitive, the empath, the creative. We're going to switch gears. Courtney, here's where I want to go. We chatted yesterday. When we chatted yesterday, you reminded me that the last time we were together, which was, not that long ago, maybe 3-4 months, it was more recent. When we were chatting on air, you reminded me that I was in the process of coming up with a new language to speak about God or the divine or the holy, that a new language was needed because the language we're using right now is not working. And so that really is, oddly, when Melissa, my assistant, had called you, you said, you reminded her of that and said, is Charlie interested in that? And the answer is, that's the whole direction of where I want to take the show. And so my first question for you is, why does that subject even interest you?
Well, because I've had other conversations with spiritually minded people, theologians. Some people have actually gone through seminary and had their own experiences with this, with wisdom teachings. And it does seem like the next generation is coming up and they are somehow being turned off by the dogmatic approach. And so I've seen it. I've seen that inspiration coming through in other conversations, and you and I had talked about it specifically, about creating a new language for these types of spiritual, we're talking about specific spiritual, mystic, revelatory experiences and God and holy divine moments and miracles, those kind of things and events. And I was mentioning the new language around it because there are a lot of really loaded, charged terms which tend to turn people off from talking about those experiences, even though they're still happening, which I think is doing a major disservice to the spiritual community. That's how it originally came up.
Yeah. And we are witnessing it in the, what do they call them? The nuns? Is that what they call them? The nuns? Non-religious?
None of the above.
Oh,
none of the above.
None of the above?
You know.
No, that's not it. It's something anyway, it's people who don't believe. They don't believe any of those things. And that's because in my mind, as I've, since for the last 4 years now, been delving deeply into the mystics and primarily the late medieval Christian mystics, and I'm fond of saying that I use Christian not that it's exclusive, but that it's familiar. Christianity is my mother tongue. That doesn't mean that I'm saying it's the only way. It's my way. It's my mother tongue, so I can speak that language. I can't speak the Kabbalah or the Sufi of other religions, but they are both in the same place. And there needs to be what the mystics believe. We, in our post-Enlightenment days, theology turned very head-oriented, very factual. Do this, don't do that. It's just, it's laws and rules. It's like the early days of Judaism. And the mystics saw Scripture allegorically or symbolically, and they saw it had to do with experience. It's experience with the divine. It's not following rules. I think I told you my goal now is to seek God, or is to seek the holy, not seeking to be holy. I have no interest in being holy, but I have extreme interest in being in union with the holy. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Oh, yeah, and I would even take it further. And this is really far out in kind of a rebel way of looking at it. I was really interested in college. I didn't end up taking this track, but I definitely had an impulse for contemplative religions and comparative religion, and have always been interested in that since I went to a small Catholic college near my home in Pennsylvania. But over the years, I went more towards psychology, which was actually a better fit for me and probably more accepted by my parents. But there's a lot of crossover in the symbolism and the artistic works and art history and comparative artworks and the different types of eras, different artwork and what was coming out in the spiritual. I love William Blake. That's a whole subject himself. But I like this idea of spirit speaking to certain individuals through these defiant acts. And I didn't recognize this, but somebody who was, been in school a long time had said, well, Courtney, you know that a lot of the saints were once rebels. And so I love this idea that, before a conversion event or before you truly come recognizing the spirit in your life or those being in contact with those holy encounters, that you can have this whole other side of your personality living out life in a certain way that could be considered unholy, right?
Yes.
But then you do make contact with the holy. You're not shut off from it. And so that's one of the other concepts that I'm thinking about, and it occurs to me, as you're talking about not the pursuit, be a holy person, but to encounter the holy. And that's one of the concepts I've been trying to discuss all along through these different educational teachings, not necessarily underneath a religion, that these encounters are happening for individuals. And yes, it's under a specific dialogue around sensitivity, but so often when you go back and look in history and you look in the text, there are these individuals who are sensitive. For example, there's a real controversial woman. She lives over in Ireland. She never learned how to read. She's in contact with what she feels are angels. And so she writes books about her teachings and all of this, and it's very controversial, and it wouldn't be accepted, the traditional religious sense. But I'm interested in her. I want to understand about how that looks for her in her reality, how it changes her as a person through transformative experience, and then also how she lives her life, that experience, because that's interesting to me. So definitely, I agree 100% with what you're saying.
Do you know Teresa of Avila, Saint Teresa of Avila, who is probably the most read person on prayer? Her book Interior Castle is 7 mansions or way stations to prayer as you get deeper and deeper into prayer. She was tried by the Inquisition for heresy. Talk about a rebel, because tragic. Because she was talking. First of all, she was a woman. So what is a woman doing teaching men in in 1500? You can't be doing that. And then
No.
she was talking a whole different language, which is today is a language. I want to take a minute. I hate it on the show when I talk too much, but I've got to tell you this thing that so I'm going to keep it as brief as I can. But
Okay.
in the Gospels, and in what's called the Synoptic Gospels, which are the ones that don't include John, they're Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus does not speak of this, never once calls himself Son of God. He calls himself Son of Man. 80 times in the Synoptic Gospels, he calls himself Son of Man. And I had a teacher in seminary that taught me that he picked that term because it had no baggage on it. Son of God had baggage that was going to come in and rule and take over Rome and free the Jews and free all this. That was not what he came to do, but he couldn't. If he had called himself Son of God, they would have thought that's what he needed to do. He referred to himself as Son of God one time in the scriptures, one time in the Gospel of John. And that is it. And I like that what he did, he defined himself by a term that he said, watch me work. You want to know what divinity is like? Watch me, feel me, touch me, listen to me, love me. This is what God is all about, not what you have perceived. What do you think of that kind of idea? That's why I use...
Absolutely. That is an absolute. He didn't want it to be politicized. He didn't want what he was going to say, that one word, to be politicized. And it is so politicized. It always is, about the king and which king. He's always talking about, it's like, doesn't matter about the king. He's talking about divinity. He talks about the God within. He talks about man being possible to do so many things. And those messages I just constantly look at and say, yes. He even talks about it, how he has to talk about all of these beautiful things of the Spirit in parables, so we can't necessarily understand what he's saying, so we can somehow receive, holy guidance, but not get in our heads about it, because obviously we're all, humans are all sensitive, and we look at it and go, oh, I have to look at this, and this part of it is charged, and it's like, the overthinking thing. And so I love that. He had to make it not political and say, man, and make himself unilaterally equal to all the people that he was talking to, so they would actually hear him. That's, part of this whole dialogue we're having is like, how can we get that again? How can we, revitalize all of this spirit and get people in contact in a new way? Because I was reading this book. It's called The Physics of Angels, and it was written by Rupert Sheldrake and Matthew Fox as co-editors. Oh. And one of the things that they talk about in one chapter is all these angels that are like unemployed in chapels. They just sit around and, wait, because they're all unemployed angels. And I thought, my goodness, how detached are we, from guides and the messengers that are supposedly here inhabiting this world to help us. Because we believe in this separation, we're letting them be idle. And so I thought that was such a good pickup and such a great way to express that in their book, because it really did nail that topic. Like, we don't even believe in these.
It's interesting you would use
to help us.
Go ahead. I want you to finish.
You go. No, that was it.
I was just reading this morning. I just beginning reading in the Revelation, and Jesus talking to John about the 7 churches. And he says he's holding 7 lampstands, and they are the lampstands of, I can't remember, but there's 7 stars in his hands. And the 7 stars are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. Each church has an angel. I've never, how many times I've read Revelation and never read that? Never caught that each church has an angel. And you're saying unemployed angels because there's no one listening to them. No one seeking them.
Yeah, I think you hear about them still. You do hear about them in these experiences of the extraordinary. That also brings up what we were talking about yesterday about near-death experiences and how oftentimes, people go through clinical death. Their spirit, what they would call their spirit, separates from the physical body. They have consciousness. They go through this typical life review, but there's usually a guardian, and sometimes it's an ancestor, a parent, maybe sometimes even a relative they don't even know. They didn't know in their earthly life. But what happens is sometimes there will be an angel or a divine being meets up with that individual and their spirit, and they take them to another location. And sometimes God is there, and there's amazing gardens and amazing conversations in the light. Many references to the light. And so they're there, they show up, they're still in these extraordinary experiences somehow, and they are encountered. People talk about them. So I think those things are also very interesting when people go through clinical death and encounter these beings and the light and God in different ways.
Yeah, so informative. You know, the language we're using now is we're talking, I want to be conscious of the fact that we're preaching to the choir in some ways. Well, especially if you're Roman Catholic, you know, and because only Romans believe in angels. You know, the conservatives, you know, they don't. You know, you got Michael and Gabriel, and other than that, there are no such thing as angels in the conservative church, which is totally unfortunate. But you know, we are preaching to the choir. I want to talk to the people, to the nuns, to the people who are disenfranchised or disappointed in the idea of God. And that's why one thing I'm not completely stopping using the word God, but I'm not using it as much because when, you know, Courtney, when I say God, you have a box that this God is in this box. Now, with you, I think your box is pretty wide open but most people have this little box that they think of as God. And so when I talk to them about God, they think they know what I'm talking about and they can follow me, but they can't. Therefore, I am much more fond of using, like Jesus used the Son of Man, I want to use the divine or the holy, because there's not a lot of baggage yet. I get to fill that bag with new ideas and with fresh ideas. Does that idea resonate with you?
Well, sure, because if people feel that God did them wrong, or things went sideways with God, or we mentioned this in our call too, God goes silent. God will go silent, and you feel isolated or left out in the cold, then shuts that conversation. But if you talk about divinity and the wide expanse of the divine, it may have the effect of curiosity, where curiosity comes in and you want to know more and you want to learn and you want to talk about divinity and examples of it and how it shows up and what it means. Whereas God might have a tendency to be a showstopper. Like you said, I think you said that. Like it just can tend to halt curiosity, because especially if there is a negative association with God, like God didn't help me and there is no God potentially. And so, as you know, I'm a big, I bring the generosity of my own spirit, to conversations and dialogue. And I certainly love talking about holy and the divine. I mean, I think that's one of the most interesting and exciting conversations happening now, and what's going on with our world, and where do we see the divine? How does it show up? And I think it allows that curiosity for the person you're talking to be receptive. Keeps the mind open, which is a beautiful thing.
Do you know you're using one of my very favorite words of all words is curiosity.
What's that?
Curiosity. It just, it runs my life. I was talking to a tattoo specialist over the weekend. And well, I don't know what you call her, but she does tattoos.
I like that, a tattoo specialist. That's great.
And my wife won't let me do it, but I had a logo made for myself once when I was in seminary, and I've wanted to get a tattoo, and my son and my wife say no. But I wanted, and what the tattoo would be a question mark, but instead of a period or a dot under the question mark would be the world. It's just questioning
nice.
Everything. Isn't that a beautiful metaphor? A metaphor for curiosity. Let me close with this, and then I want your comments on it, and we'll wrap her up. I have an interpretation of a couple of sentences written by Amos, the prophet Amos, and I think around. I'm going to have the dates wrong, and a theologian is going to correct me, but I think it was around 600 BC. And he wrote this, Courtney, in that day, and I think we are in that day right now, so I'm thinking, in 2024, people will be so hungry for words from the Lord that they won't even know what they're hungry for. And I think that's the day we're in right now. I think we're looking for something. Something's missing. We're looking for something that is not definable by science. It is unbelievable. It is preposterous. And yet there's beautiful resonance and truth and wonder in it. What do you think about that?
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that there's an absurdity. There's an absurdity to some of these mystical experiences that just go beyond normalcy, material reality. They're happening more frequent to people. I also think it harkens back to big movements that were established, like AA. That's one of the things that Bill W. talked about, was this hunger that he had to know divine, to know God. And Jung talked with him about that and wrote a famous letter that said, there is this whole idea around being separated or feel like you're being shut off from spirit that leads to addiction. You want to be close to the divine. And in Buddhism, there's a similar concept, the hungry ghosts, that lead to feelings of loss and being disconnected. But I think when you're talking about that hunger and where it can lead you to the darkness, it can also lead you into the light, to being welcoming of the spirit, to cherish the spirit, to see it show up in your life every day, to recognize it when you are in the company of it. And those of us who have been blessed with these absurd encounters with the divine, we need to recognize that they're not just aberrations. They're part of our life as spiritual beings on this planet and on this earth. So I think that hunger can very well be fueled, get us back in touch, that deep sense of divinity that is really our birthright, and there is no separation.
Like they say in the African American church, can I have an amen? That is...
Yeah, well, I missed my calling, but when you're talking about divinity, I'm right there with you, Charlie. It fires me up. It fires me up.
Courtney Marchesani, you are just unbelievably cool. As I told you yesterday on the phone, I wish we lived closer because we would be great friends, and I would love for our spouses to meet. So I think all four of us would have a great time together. I've got here listed. I've got your website. I've got your free sensitivity test, and I've got the 4 gifts of your book, the 4 gifts of the highly sensitive. Four gifts of the highly sensitive. So that probably should cover just about everything. Do you think, the way people can get a hold of you?
Oh yeah, the book is, like I told you, it was a labor of love for me to put my work into really an educational source material for people to understand it. So yes, it is my cornerstone.
Okay, so I encourage everybody to get the book. This is one I'm actually going to read. I ordered it. It's coming in Saturday, and I'm going to read the book of a guest after I've done the podcast for 4 times. It took that long to get me to read the book.
It's okay. It comes at the right time. It's divine timing, right? We talked about that yesterday too. It comes when it comes.
It comes
when it's supposed to come.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
Let me close her off by telling everybody thank you for listening to the next chapter with Charlie. We're So glad to have you here. And this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.